Back in late 2016, early 2017, I was super hyped for Ghost Recon Wildlands. I didn't get a chance to play much of the beta, so I was ultra hyped to play the full game as part of a full team. And for those of you that don't know, Wildlands is this third-person shooter game where you can play with 3 other people as part of an elite special forces squad. The only trouble being is you need to find 3 friends that are competent and reliable enough to play on the regular. So for that, I joined a Discord server. For reasons that'll become evident, I don't really want to name names here, so I'm not going to tell you what the server was called, or their usernames or real names of any of the folks involved. I know, that's always the cop-out line people give when they're just making up a story for internet points, but I was witness to what might have serious legal ramifications for those involved, so I don't want to say anything that might later be found to be inaccurate or anything that could be used to incriminate or defame someone, especially if they might not necessarily deserve it. I know that might sound pointlessly convoluted, but I can promise you that you'll see what I mean by the end of this post. So, this Discord server had only about a small but dedicated membership of just over 100 people, all chatting and posting in a variety of different channels. But very quickly, one particular user stood out, and we'll just call this person Tom for sake of simplicity. The server wasn't just people looking for other players to squad up with. The admins had created all kinds of different channels for non-video game related talk. These were obviously much less active than the other looking for group channels, but Tom enjoyed posting in them to a great deal, and his posts were unusual, to put it kindly. I remember the first post of Tom's I saw. It was a selfie of a young man with blue eyes, strawberry blonde hair, and sharp features. He was sweating profusely. It was kind of unsettling, actually, as he had this really intense look on his face. His eyes were wide, his veins were bulging, and it looked like his jaw was clamped shut. Not the kind of thing that you'd expect to see while scrolling through a channel entitled Casual Chat. Tom had added a caption claiming that he just ran like 2 marathons or something, which is basically a world record for what his critics in the replies said. He also made wild claims that he'd aced the Hell Week part of Navy SEAL training, and it only failed to graduate because he made the instructors look bad. Basically, he was full of crap. But no matter how many times he got called out and humiliated, he kept on coming back with more and more laughably spurious claims of personal glory. And perhaps his single most effective and lauded critic was a guy that we'll just call Clancy. Clancy won the hearts and minds of the whole server by basically humiliating Tom in increasingly hilarious and creative ways. He'd make memes of him, debunk his wild claims with witty little link-laden retorts, and he was the perfect antidote to all of Tom's soul-sapping, self-aggrandizing poison, and for that, we had a lot of affection for him. The admins, all 2 of them, refused to step in and remove either user, basically saying it was all just banter and that no one was saying or doing anything ban-worthy. To be fair, it was all fairly harmless, but as things began to escalate, the once playful conflict grew increasingly bitter and increasingly vicious. Soon it wasn't just Clancy making fun of Tom, it was a massive chunk of the server, all under the assumption that if he really didn't like it, Tom would just leave. After all, he was the one who kept giving them ammo by posting weird selfies and making up cringe-worthy stories. What came next happened quickly and mostly offline. I didn't exactly check the server religiously either, so some of this I saw with my own eyes, while other stuff I heard secondhand accounts of. But this is how it went as I understand it. At some point, Tom and Clancy started arguing back and forth in one of the server's text channels, and it got so brutal that for the first time, one of the server admins actually stepped in and told them to take things to their DMs. This is where things get sketchy, because I don't know exactly what was said in these DMs, and I haven't spoken to anyone who really does. No screenshots were taken, and neither user really talked about it, and no one rushed to find out until after this whole thing concluded. However, I think it's fair to assume that they both went at each other pretty hard, until Tom basically vowed to find Clancy so he could kick his butt or whatever dumb threat he'd thrown out there. After that, Tom actually went dark for a little while, and I only learned about the whole argument thing after asking where the old rascal had gotten to. It was definitely welcome news. I mean, he was incredibly annoying, but he also hadn't left the server, meaning that there was a chance that he and Clancy had just talked the whole thing out. After a few days later, Tom proved that little theory to be way off the mark. He posted in all of the text channels about how he had a genius-level plan and that Clancy was going to be sorry for disrespecting him. Clancy then responded by telling him to give it his best shot and he'd relish a chance to break his teeth in. Admins once again stepped in, warning them of bans if they didn't stop threatening violence, so they either took things to DMs again or just quit their bickering, while everyone just figured Tom's threats were empty. But it turns out, they weren't. After Clancy was offline for a few solid days, people started asking where he was, and to get a definitive answer, some folks reached out to a member of the server who was Clancy's in-real-life friend. People were genuinely speculating that Tom had made good on his threats or something, so there was actually a great deal of relief when they discovered that Clancy was okay. However, someone very close to Clancy was very much not okay. His sister, who had been subject to a brutal attack while attempting to drive home from work. She was in the hospital, in critical condition too from what we heard, and he was offline because he was taking time out to help his family and caring for his sister. It was horrible news, but like I said, there was this element of relief that Tom hadn't done anything crazy. Days later, he proved us wrong again. Now this part of the story I actually did bear witness to, because it was Tom's first video post in a while, and I was in the mood for a little hate watching. What also attracted me to watch the video were all the replies saying things like, "WTF, dude," and "That's so messed up, why post that?" I've always had a morbid curiosity over violent content, definitely not the healthiest of inclinations, but it is what it is, I guess. So I ended up pressing the little play button instead of deducing its content through the replies. The opening of the video consists of nothing remotely discernible, as the person filming is obviously just walking with a phone on record. Then suddenly, you hear a voice, Tom's voice, quite easily recognizable thanks to the host of other videos he'd posted of himself working out or talking nonsense. You hear him ask someone, "Hey, I think I know your brother." A confused reply comes from a youngish sounding girl who's obviously puzzled by the vagueness of the statement. But then, Tom says something like, "I'm not sure I know his name, but we play a lot of video games together." The clarification obviously rings true with the girl, who laughs before throwing some quip about how her brother never comes out of his bedroom some days. Tom then says, "At least he's a sports team fan, right?" Tom named a sports team, but again, for the sake of anonymity, I'm not going to repeat it. The girl then confirmed that yes, her brother was indeed a fan of this particular sports team, and this is where the context got downright chilling. Clancy's profile picture was the sports team's logo, and it was the mention of that team that had 2 and 2 finally making 4 for me. Then, as if to drive the point home, the attack began. Again, the video just showed a flurry of nothingness, but you could tell what was happening from the audio. Tom was beating the absolute life out of this girl, and when he'd finished hitting her, you could hear him doing something else. And the final shot of the video showed the results of the attack, and I can assure you, they were beyond sickening. It took the admins way too long to react, and I think the server saw it before they finally took it down. Tom didn't even give it any context either. He knew people would figure it out, and when they did, things got crazy. I was glued to that server for a few days after that, constantly checking it from my phone while at work, and then just sitting there watching things unfold after I clocked out and drove home. Everyone wanted to know how in God's name Tom had figured out where Clancy's sister was, and if indeed it was her who was attacked in this video. I'm not sure we ever got a definitive answer from Clancy, but after figuring out how Tom had worked out where she worked, it was all but proven. You see, way back when he'd first joined the server, Clancy had posted about how his sister had brought home a bunch of free food from the restaurant she worked at, with proof of the abundance coming in the form of the photo. This photo showed stacks and stacks of takeout containers, each bearing the same name and logo of the restaurant his sister worked at. And this is how Tom had figured out where she worked. He either lived close enough for him to just drive over, or he'd taken the time to drive out from God knows where to enact his despicable idea of revenge. This is where the server seemed to divide itself into 2 distinct camps. One camp worked at forwarding as much information as possible to the cops, with a lot of that info coming from Tom's collection of insane video posts. I guess they figured that with as much information as possible, the cops could figure out where Tom was at. But the other camp was doing some sleuthing of their own, only unlike the former group who passed all their info to the cops, this group passed their info directly to Clancy. Then one day, almost all of the server's text channels disappeared. I remember waking up for work, then rolling over to grab my phone so I could check for any overnight developments. But when I brought the server up, I was sort of taken aback to find that nearly all of them had been nuked. There were plenty of users questioning the decision in the surviving text channels, with some even tagging the server admins to try and get a quicker answer. Neither admins answered a single question, but we didn't have to wait long to figure out why. Following the deletion of the text channels, I suspect it was only a matter of time before the server was just shut down entirely. It wasn't even about a video game anymore. The entire focus of the server was on the attack and the subsequent responses to it. So I guess it was only natural that the creators would eventually grow tired of the whole thing and either delete the server or just move on. Eventually it was deleted, but not before one final climax of a development. I didn't actually see the post myself. I woke up to the server having been deleted, but I had added a number of fairly close friends that I met in the server, and one of them was able to spill the proverbial tea for me. One of the last major posts in the server had been a link to a news story. My buddy had saved this link and forwarded it to me upon my request. There had been a murder in St. Paul, Minnesota, one where an apartment invader had beaten, tortured, and murdered their victim before fleeing in a stolen vehicle that was later abandoned. The article didn't name the victim or show any pictures of them, but it did include a statement from the cops that implied that the murder was linked to violent online video games. We had no way of confirming our suspicions at first, but then about a week later, I was sent another article. This one did have a picture, and I think my jaw must have hit the floor when I saw the victim's face, staring back at me with those pale blue eyes, with an uncharacteristically sweet grin on his face. It was Tom. Somehow, someone had gotten into his apartment, then done unspeakable things to him, and the only link was video games. We knew what had happened, and we knew who'd done it too. But more importantly, we both understood why the server was shut down. To us, it looked an awful lot like folks were trying to hide the evidence of something, and I personally believe that that something was the second camp, continually feeding Clancy with a torrent of information regarding Tom, who may or may not have attacked his sister. Then, in the end, he just acted on it. I think people were so scared that they'd get wrapped up in aiding and abetting a murder that they just nuked the whole server completely. Like I said, I'm still buddies with a few of the guys from the server, but the admins and the vast majority of those who fed Clancy info had either deleted their accounts or tried to ghost as best they can. Last I checked, Tom's murder is still unsolved, and there have been no arrests made, but since the cops have a pretty good inkling what the motive was, I figured it's only a matter of time before the law catches up with people. Surely all those chat logs are recoverable. I mean, nothing is ever really deleted online, right? There's all the meta and cloud data still in the computers, and I'm no expert, but I'm pretty sure it's all trackable. I'm still not about to name names or anything like that or give away any serious details, but between you and me, keep a lookout for headlines regarding this whole story in the coming years. It's still very much an active investigation, and it leaves me and other folks from that server in a pretty weird position. See, on paper, the moral thing to do would be to go to the cops and tell them what happened, but then who's to say that Tom didn't deserve it? A huge chunk of that server's occupants, who fed Clancy all the info and maybe spurred him on to do something, they probably have zero regrets and can sleep like a baby every night thinking that they did the right thing. But me, it just doesn't sit right with me for some reason, and I have a feeling that it never will. Back before smartphones and social media and all that other stuff, you had internet relay chat. These were primitive chat rooms where you just picked a username and boom, you could talk to all manner of complete strangers about innocent and not so innocent topics. If you've heard the term ASL before, that's where it came from, because you always open by asking someone their age, sex, and location, and what you got in reply could wildly vary from user to user. One night, I see this username, Desert Roads F18. I figured it's probably a girl around my age in the southwest or southeast, and given that I was still living in Texas at the time, I figured that I'd just hit her up. I was right about her being in the south, as she was apparently just over the state line in New Mexico. So that gave us something to talk about at first, but then as the conversation meandered on, things started getting more and more personal. She told me her name was Rose, and that she needed someone to cheer her up. So I set about trying to do just that. I thought I'd done a pretty good job, and when she seemed sufficiently chipper again, I asked if she wanted to talk about whatever was making her blue. And that's when she tells me that she was sad because she had to drop out of college, but that she'd done so in order to take care of her mother, who was suffering from a very painful variety of terminal cancer. Honestly, that was just about the heaviest thing I'd heard at the time, and I thought her attitude to it was nothing short of incredible. Sure, it hurt to put her dreams on hold for a while, but it would be worth it to know that she'd been a dutiful daughter, as she phrased it. At one point, and I know this sounds crazy, but I asked if she needed me to send her any money. Honestly, it was just bait to see if the girl was some kind of scammer. I mean, I'm dumb, but I'm not that dumb. And when she said no, that she'd never take money off of someone as sweet as me, direct quote, I was convinced that she was legitimate. And not just legit either, but maybe the sweetest, maybe most pure-hearted girl I'd ever come across. We talked for hours and hours about every little thing, all our passions and interests and hopes for the future. I think it was around 9 p.m. when I first sent her a message, and we didn't stop talking until just after 4 in the morning. It was that kind of intense, and I had butterflies in my stomach the whole time, especially after she sent me a picture of herself. She was gorgeous, and when I playfully accused her of being a catfish, she sent me a picture of her holding up her palm with my username and a rough heart drawn on it. I felt like the luckiest guy in the world. She was the kind of girl I'd be way too nervous to approach in real life, but as I mentioned, I had all that internet confidence on my side, and it seemed to have paid off massively. We kept on talking for like a whole 5 days afterwards, morning till night, getting more and more affectionate and romantic as the days went by. It got to the point where we discussed long-distance relationships, moving cities, if only for a short while. Like I said, it was that level of intense. I remember the pair of us being like, whoa, this is all going very quickly and we haven't even talked on the phone yet. So, to fix that, we agreed to a phone call the following evening. The plan was, I'd hit her up around the time we agreed, get her phone number, then we'd talk on the phone for a little while. I was very excited. In fact, I looked forward to it all day. All the crap I had to put up with at work, and it was an unusually high amount that day. And it was all just like water off the duck's back. None of it bothered me because after I clocked out, I'd get to go home and talk to Rose. The thing is, things didn't quite work out like that. I got home, got online, logged into IRC chat, but Rose's username was nowhere to be seen. No big deal, I thought. I'll just make some dinner and wait for her to come online. So, that's what I do. I make some food, take a shower, walk to the corner store to pick up some beers, but even once I'd gotten all that out of the way, there was still no sign of Rose. Around maybe 8 or 9 in the evening, I started to think that I was being stood up, and it's kind of embarrassing to remember how upset and anxious I'd actually got. But eventually my patience paid off, and the click of that chat notification sound had me running to my PC to find that Rose had sent me a message. She apologized for being late, saying it was typical that she'd get held up picking up medications on the one evening that she had something planned. I tell her it's no problem, and then she gives me a phone number to call. It was a 575 number, and I knew that was the area code for a bunch of New Mexico phone numbers, so it all matched up with the story that she'd given me thus far. But then, she tells me that when I call, I'm to ask for Annie and not Rose. When I asked why that was, she told me that her full name was Roseanne, and that she'd always gone by Annie, a name she now loathed in favor of Rose. I did think that was kind of unusual, but it didn't put me off calling her in the slightest. She also told me that her uncle might answer the phone, so not to be alarmed or intimidated by some moody-sounding older man if he happened to pick up the call. I take this all in my stride, totally unquestioning, and when I was ready, I called the number. And just like Rose had said, a man with a very unfriendly tone answered the call. So, just as she told me to do so, I asked the guy if I could speak to Annie, and there was a long silence, and then the man asked, "Who is this?" I was honest with him. I told him I was friends with Annie and that she'd asked me to call her. Again, there was a long silence, then literally said the words, "If this is supposed to be a joke, sure as hell isn't a funny one." And then it was my turn to be silent for a few seconds as I tried to work out exactly what I'd done wrong. It definitely wasn't the wrong number. I'd been ultra careful in dialing the numbers, so it couldn't have been all that. And all I could think to do was just ask again, being polite as possible while apologizing for the confusion. The man seemed to relent a little, then explained that the confusion was entirely on my part. Annie couldn't have told me to call her that night because Annie was dead. The man then excused himself, sounding like he was choking back emotion as he did so, then he hung up. I'm not gonna lie, I was extremely freaked out at first. I didn't exactly think that I'd been talking to a ghost on IRC or anything dumb like that, but I was most definitely in a state of shock and confusion. I typed to Rose, "Are you sure you gave me the right number?" And after some time, she replied that she had indeed given me the wrong number, and apologized if it had caused any trouble. Me, like a total idiot, takes her apology at face value, even though there's this burning sensation in my head telling me that something is very wrong. I call the second number that she gives me, which again has a New Mexico area code, and as it rings, I realize I'm actually sweating from how nervous I am. I'm also literally praying that Rose isn't just ghosting me, and the longer the call rang for, the more and more beside myself I became. In the end, the call went to an answering machine, and the answering machine apparently belonged to the University of New Mexico's Adult Psychiatric Center. Things still didn't make sense, but they started to make a little more sense, if you get what I'm saying. If some kind of mental health issue was at play, I honestly thought that I could have looked past it. I really did like this girl that much, or at least I liked the idea of that girl enough to look past it. But again, things didn't quite go as I planned them. When I asked Rose if she lived in the UNM's psych center, she simply replied, "Lol." I thought this was her way of breaking the truth to me, so I launched into some line-by-line speech of how I didn't care and I was willing to look past it. And this was before the whole typing feature that modern direct messages apps employ, so I had no idea that Rose had been typing some big all-caps reply, probably from the moment I told her, "It's okay, I understand." I don't remember what it said word for word, but it was pretty nasty. In the most humiliating way possible, Rose told me that, well, there was no Rose, and that idiots like me were so stupid and lonely that we believe anything we're told. It went on and on like that, the most brutally insulting and demeaning things you can possibly dream up, and in the end, I just found myself asking, why? And do you know what this person said in reply? Because it's fun. I guess this sounds kind of pathetic, but it hurt. It really hurt me. And I realized that there were people out there who got off on building up people's hopes, only to dash them when they least expected it. I'd rather they were a financial scammer because at least they'd actually get something out of it. But going to all that trouble and effort of convincing me that Rose was real, and being satisfied with just knowing I was hurting. The existence of people like that is something that still downright terrifies me. I don't know how many of you will remember the game Second Life. I don't know if it's even still a thing, to be honest, but going back almost 2 decades now, I used to be super into it. Think of it as being the first real incarnation of the metaverse, as it was essentially just a social life simulator for people incapable of socializing in the real world. I say that with love, after all. I was one of those socially stunted individuals, and in actual fact, I met some of the most fascinating, innovative, and downright bizarre people I'd ever come across through Second Life. I know of a guy who started a free virtual nightclub. Literally just him in a little room, playing his own set list to anyone who would listen and hang out. The guy's a professional DJ now, legit living his dream, all after starting out on a freaking Second Life of all places. There were also game nights, D&D sessions, speed dating sessions, all in this virtual world, and it was through a speed dating session that I met an American girl named Tara. Tara was a pretty nice girl, and although actual dating was off the menu due to the distance, we got on like a house on fire. We had a lot of similar hobbies and interests, and I was always very honest and open with the things I told her. Tara, on the other hand, seemed to have a certain very secretive hobby, one she wasn't too keen on revealing to me at first. It seemed to take up an awful lot of her time, and I think she wasn't the only one doing it because she mentioned having discussed it with some close friends. After that, they all began doing this mysterious thing that was somehow thrilling enough to obsess over, but too embarrassing to share with a nice boy that she met on the internet. As you can imagine, I was incredibly curious as to what this thing was, and whenever we'd voice chat on Skype, I'd often pester her to tell me what it was. Eventually, I gave up on asking her and figured that she'd just tell me when she was good and ready. And eventually she did, and I swear I'd never have guessed in a million years what that secret hobby actually was. But what I also didn't count on was being so completely creeped out by it that it marked the beginning of the end for our little online tryst. It goes a little something like this. Tara lived in a smallish sized town in America. I'm not sure what it's called or what part of America it's in, but it was small enough for one horrible car accident to send the entire community into mourning. 2 trucks had collided on a dark road one night, one driven by a drunk driver who walked away from the crash with only cuts and bruises, the other being driven by a college girl and 3 of her friends, all of whom either died in the crash or afterwards as a result of their injuries. According to Tara, the drunk guy had managed to avoid all charges because his cousin was the governor's wife or something crazy like that. Some kind of corruption was at play. So instead, Tara and her friends had taken justice into their own hands. Their hobby consisted of them tracking down the drunk driver and his family members online. Then they'd create fake email addresses, fake MySpace profiles, all in the name of each of the 4 girls who died in the crash. They'd seriously deck them out too, using actual photographs of the deceased girls in order to make the profiles look as real as possible. Some would just bear the girls' names, whereas others would be things like the ghost of XYZ at AOL.com, stuff like that. Then, once the profiles were complete, they'd use them to haunt the drunk driver's family, friends, and coworkers. At the time, I think it was the single craziest thing I'd ever heard, but I wasn't completely put off by it. Sure, it was a very unusual hobby and definitely not the kind of thing I'd be into personally, but at the same time, I could understand why she did it. That level of corruption for the guy to just skirt without any formal charges. If that were my friends killed by that guy, I'd want to see some variety of justice too. But to create all those fake profiles with the names and likeness of the victims, that was something that I couldn't quite justify. Tara herself admitted their activities had some dubious moral foundations, as she didn't know whether the family members of the deceased actually approved of what they were doing. But in the grand scheme of things, she believed that what she was doing was right. For a while, I believed that too, but then I decided to do a little of my own research. I don't know why it took me literally days to cross-reference some of the info she'd given me, but when I did, I discovered that Tara hadn't quite given me the full story. The man who'd apparently been responsible for the girls' deaths had been completely sober on the night of the accident, and in reality, it was the 19-year-old driver of the college girl's car that was driving while intoxicated. The guy had been suffering some engine trouble and had pulled over to the side of some well-lit highway, flicked on his hazard lights, then got to work checking his engine out. Around this same time, the girls, who were already traveling way over the speed limit, came tearing around a corner, apparently didn't see the guy at all as he was parked at the roadside, then smashed into his car at almost 50 miles an hour. The guy got out of the way in time, or they'd have pinned him between their bumper and the hood of his car. The girls, however, their car was tumbling off the road and down an embankment, where it eventually burst into flames. Once all this evidence emerged at his hearing, a judge ruled that the guy hadn't committed any crime, and that the onus lay with the 19-year-old driver of the other car. The guy was obviously dealing with a lot of guilt, too. He was extremely emotional at his hearing, apologizing not having serviced his vehicle earlier, and he basically took way more responsibility than he ought to, and reached out to the families to try to aid in their respective grieving processes. Essentially, he was a good guy, one who'd been traumatized by accidentally being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And from what I could gather, most of the community agreed that was the case, all except for Tara and a group of her close friends, who decided that regardless of his intentions, the man needed to be punished. To me, this was already completely unacceptable. It made Tara seem like an evil brat who just couldn't accept the tragic reality. To harass the guy was one thing, but to actually try and haunt him using the names and likeness of those poor dead girls, it made me realize just how sick she really was. Or rather, I didn't think she was sick at the time, just mistaken. But then when I tried to explain that she might have gotten her wires crossed, she turned nasty, really nasty. I'll try not to bore you with the details of the horrible things she said. They might have been grim, but they were depressingly predictable too. I was accused of misogyny, bootlicking, being a police shill, and when I tried to defend myself, she blocked all lines of communication. I was devastated at first. I know that seems silly given what an absolute horror she turned out to be, but I suppose I was more mourning the person I'd hoped she was as opposed to the person she turned out to be. I want to say that I learned some valuable lesson from that whole experience. I'm just not sure what that lesson is. Maybe it's that way sometimes. There's a huge difference between the way people see the world and the way the world actually is. Not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but it's when people inflict that worldview onto others, that's when things start to get very frightening indeed. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Easily my most unsettling experience with any kind of online stranger was when I met a girl in an AOL chat room. At least they claimed to be a girl, one around my age of 16 too, but thinking about it now, I could have been talking to just about anyone. I used to visit this particular chat room quite often, and this one time, I noticed someone was spamming a bunch of evangelical Christian stuff in the main chat. A lot of it sounded very familiar to me. I wouldn't call myself religious or anything, but my grandma took me and my sister to church enough times for me to know my way around the scriptures. But then other parts sounded like some pretty wild stuff that they had either learned somewhere else or just had made up on the fly. The user was being warned over and over again to stop spamming, but they always ignored the warnings and always got kicked. Nowadays, companies can remotely scan the product's IDs of smart devices, meaning any new account can get an instant ban hammer, but back then, the crazy Christian girl could just come back with a new username on the drop of a hat. I could have just gone to a different chat room, but to put it bluntly, I like that one. So, unlike the admins, whose only tactic was whack-a-mole chat bans, I decided on a different method to rid the room of the proselytizing menace. I decided to engage her. It started out as pure trolling, but curiosity soon got the better of me, and I found myself wanting to know what their whole deal was. I didn't think the conversation would last 5 minutes. Turns out, it would last almost 2 hours. So we had some preliminary chit-chat, and like I said, they claimed to be a newly 16-year-old girl who simply had a passion for faith and church and all that stuff. Aside from that, she seemed like a fairly normal teenage girl. She was into boy bands, she seemed to love Whataburger, but that was just about all we talked about in terms of normal day-to-day stuff. The vast majority of our conversation consisted of religious discussion, and whoever this person was, they had some extremely disturbing opinions. One of the first things they told me which really stood out was when she said, "Satan is inside of you." I want to know exactly what she meant by that, and if I had to guess, I'd have said that she was implying that some kind of inherent evil was inside of me. But no, she threw me a total curveball, and at first I honestly just thought it was funny. This girl, who claimed her name was Mary, claimed that every night the devil himself appeared in my bedroom. Then, while I was fast asleep, he, and these are her words, diddled me. This wasn't some juvenile metaphor either. Mary was deadly serious in her claim that Satan himself was physically violating me on a nightly basis. That's what she meant when she said that he was inside of me. Like I said, I thought this was very amusing, and I still couldn't quite tell if this person was high-level trolling or not. so I decided to carry on chatting to her to see what else she'd come out with. She echoed a great deal of right-wing Christian nonsense that you hear in a lot of other places, and not just harmless God and country stuff either. I'm talking the apocalypse is just around the corner kind of thing, and the only thing that'll save humanity is if we consent to some kind of mass sacrifice, a la the flood from the Noah Ark story. I told her this was an interesting take, mainly as like a backhanded compliment because it all sounded insanely nuts. But I think she took it as genuine interest because she asked if I'd help her kill certain people she called names that I won't repeat here for decency's sake. I told her no, obviously, but that I was still interested in her ideas, so I just let her carry on. She had this weird way of being incredibly insulting to me, like telling me I was a godless sinner bound for the lake of fire, but also wrapping it up in a "I'm trying to help you because I love you" vibe. She eventually got bored of telling me how the world worked, and that's all she focused on for a while, trying to fully convert me to her worldview in the clumsiest way imaginable, and I kept politely declining, hoping that it would in fact be me who deprogrammed her. But in the end, she gave up and started saying some incredibly dark things about people taking their own lives. Looking back on it, I figured that she must have been struggling with severe mental illness because her mood seemed to shift so radically when she realized I wasn't receptive to her preaching. She told me that if she couldn't help save the world, then there was no point in living in it, and that she had been thinking about taking her own life so she could be closer to God. I told her that that was a sin, actually kind of surprised she hadn't factored that into it, but just like a lot of other stuff, her own opinions totally contradicted the actual biblical teachings. She told me that God had personally told her that there were sometimes a good time to take your own life, and that Christians who did so in the name of Jesus would always sit at God's right hand. I was actually really freaked out when she first said it because by that phase, I was thoroughly convinced that she believed her own hype. She told me, "I'm gonna cut my wrists in a hot bath now," and I actually begged her not to. But then suddenly, when she typed, "I'm doing it right now, it hurts," I began to get a whiff of bullcrap. I typed back, "How can you type if you're hurting yourself?" And after that, she didn't reply, but it was way too late for her. I was convinced that she'd only said it for attention. After that, I was kind of bored with her whole shtick, so I closed the chat window after telling her to get help. If she really had hurt herself in some way, then telling her get help would be all I could do about it, really. I didn't know her real name, where she was from, none of that, but at the same time, if she really was just talking crap, then she really did need to seek some help. Her username was still in the chat list when I logged off, so I figured that I'd see it again the next time I logged on. Only I didn't. The first time I didn't see her username or any of the variants of it, I figured that I'd probably just missed her. The second time I wondered if she was just taking a break, maybe had some family over or something. But the third time, I just got this terrible feeling that she'd actually made good on her threats to hurt herself. Obviously, I had no way of confirming or disproving that, so I just had to go on not knowing. I'd always check if the girl's username was there, for months afterwards too, but it never was. On more than one occasion, I saw someone in the main chat asking what happened to that crazy religious girl. I didn't want to go alarming them by bringing up what she told me, which I still thought might have simply been attention-seeking at that stage. I'd only be doing her job for her if I helped fuel some kind of mass panic regarding their seemingly fictitious situation. I actually thought they might be watching an amusement from some brand new inconspicuous username, but as time went by, I started to think Mary had actually made good on her threats. I suppose I'll never really know, and I can't rule out the possibility that she was just some elaborate troll before trolling was even really a thing. But there's always a part of me that worries over the idea that she was genuine, a traumatized young woman who tried to understand the world through the lens of religion, one who gave up when things got too bleak to handle. So, back when I was hardcore into DayZ, I used to clan up with a group of guys from the US, and we play on a nearly nightly basis. DayZ is basically this giant multiplayer zombie survival game, and much of the appeal hinges around random interactions with complete strangers. Most of the time, they'll just shoot at you while saying mean things about your mom, but every so often, someone comes in peace. And this is how we met Rabbit. Rabbit crawled right up to our base while we were just screwing around. Easily could have killed us all if he wanted to, but he didn't. I can't overstate how much of a setback that would have been. We'd been accumulating supplies for months by that point, and we'd have lost everything if Rabbit had tossed a grenade or two our way. But instead of getting greedy and talking us out, he started talking to us via text chat. Text chat on DayZ is barely visible, like you can really not see it unless you're looking for it, but suddenly, we see someone talking to us, and after a few seconds of just abject panic, we realize they're friendly, and we started talking back. We learned that Rabbit was from Russia, and that he'd learned English from watching Western-dubbed anime, and he called himself Rabbit for 2 reasons. 1, he wasn't comfortable sharing his name, voice, or location online, and 2, he had huge ears. He was very self-deprecating like that, which is a very endearing quality, so he soon found himself assimilated into our little clan, and he hunted and scavenged with us regularly. He was kind of skittish at first, and naturally kind of quiet because he didn't use a mic, but he slowly warmed up to us, and after a few weeks, he asked for a link to the Discord server that we'd been pestering him to join. It was only a small one, just the 5 of us after Rabbit joined, and the process of him being quiet and skittish before opening up repeated itself. And this is how we found out what Rabbit did for a living. At first, all he said was that he worked with computers, so we assumed that he just had some pretty regular IT job. But it quickly became obvious that he didn't just make spreadsheets all day. I don't know much about coding, but one of our clan did, and according to him, Rabbit was basically a genius-level coder. He had made some good money, but when he told us the exact amount, I almost fell out of my gaming chair. Rabbit told us his yearly salary was around $730,000, and that's with the dollar sign. But since the figure was so obscenely high for a quote-unquote IT guy, I figured that he must have meant Russian rubles or something. But no, he meant 730,000 US, which meant if he'd been working that salary band for a couple of years, our new Russian friend was a bona fide millionaire. A few of us didn't believe it at first and figured it was just Russian trolling at its finest. The coder guy, on the other hand, he figured that there might be something to it. We pressed him a little, and he definitely played it coy for a while, but eventually he came out and told us how he made his money. Rabbit wasn't just some IT guy. Rabbit claimed that he was a hacker. Now this time, the vast majority of us just didn't believe him, or rather we figured that he might have been over-exaggerating his job description. After all, if he was some master hacker capable of making millions through digital heists or whatever, why didn't he just mod the heck out of DayZ and become an in-game god? He replied by telling us how that wouldn't be fun, and that only children cheat at games. It sounds like a total excuse written down, but in the moment, I kinda bought it. I still wanted more proof, but it wasn't like he mouthed off about it the first time we met him. The general rule of thumb is that anyone who says they're a hacker online is definitely not a hacker, but we'd been talking to Rabbit for months by that point, and we literally had to squeeze it out of him. Then there was the fact that he was just so freaking private as he was. I knew all the other clan buddies' full names and had a few of them on Facebook, even sent one a birthday gift to his home address one time. But we still knew nothing about Rabbit, even after months of talking and gaming. Like I might have said, I was 90% convinced, but I still wanted that little bit of proof. Call it a juvenile desire to see a fiber optic magic trick or what have you, but I asked Rabbit if he'd like to hack me. I didn't want him to steal my identity or drain my bank accounts, nothing sinister like that. I just wanted him to do something, and I figured some low-hanging fruit would be my Amazon Alexa. I had it hooked up to a bunch of stuff in my apartment, not quite a full smart home or anything like that, but definitely not a dumb home if you want to call it that. That'd give Rabbit plenty of stuff to play with if he had the chops, and as it turned out, he did. This almost complete stranger, thousands and thousands of miles away in deepest, darkest Russia, put on a literal light show in my apartment while playing weird German house music through all the smart speakers in my home. It was incredible, truly impressive. We had a real-life Russian hacker as a clanmate, and he was actually a really sweet guy. He wouldn't talk about what he did, but he did clarify one thing for us. He didn't hack into banks or pull off mega heists or anything from the movies. What Rabbit and his hacker buddies did was much smarter. In short, Rabbit wrote programs that skimmed a fraction of a penny off of financial transactions all over the world. Half a penny obviously isn't a lot of money, but when the process is repeated hundreds of thousands of times a day in multiple different countries, those half pennies start to really add up. Rabbit didn't even like the word hacker. He was just a nerd who wrote computer programs because he hated going outside too much to get a job. He didn't think what he did was very cool, but we sure did. We liked having Rabbit around, and that's why we were so bummed when he suddenly disappeared. I say bummed, but it was more like mourning, because the last interaction we'd had with Rabbit scared the crap out of us. All he said was, "I think I hacked the wrong person. I might not be around for a while." Then his little green online indicator turned to gray, and that was the last we ever heard of Rabbit. I hope he's okay, and I imagine the other older DayZ guys hope he is too, but Rabbit was never one for bullcrap. If he thought he was in trouble, then I'd put money on it being bad, and I know that in Russia, there are some very powerful and very bad individuals who can up and disappear you if they want you gone bad enough. I pray that didn't happen to Rabbit, but without knowing anything about him, there's no way of me looking him up. But even if I did know stuff about him, maybe there wouldn't be anything left to find. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are some super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, no, there won't be a feet reveal.